In this video, I want to talk about Christianity's fake intellectual problem. And, as with a lot of these videos, this will critique mostly my evangelical side of Christianity where I hung out growing up. And also it's going to critique apologists a little bit more. I haven't done a video about apologists for a little while, but I've been doing some reflecting on this, and I don't really want to take up any specific apologetic claims in this video, but I want to take aim at what apologetics is doing. And I want to argue that apologists actually really hurt their cause. I've argued before that apologetics is dangerous. I think apologetics really just doesn't really serve the function that apologists think it's serving. I also think that apologetics is giving us sort of a fake, like almost cosplayed intellectualism that is also hurting people and isn't really helping actually intelligent people. So basically this video is going to talk about why apologetics ruins religion, why apologists aren't really intellectuals, and why they need to cosplay as intellectuals, and hopefully talk about what a better way forward is for actually having like a thoughtful, intelligent, religious dialogue experience. So with all that in mind, here we go. My name is Chris. I have a Master of Divinity and a PhD in Christian origins. On this channel, I mostly talk about Christian origins and biblical studies. So if you haven't done so yet, take a second and subscribe. So when I make videos arguing about Christian apologetics, arguing that it's a waste of time, arguing that apologists are wrong, which inevitably they almost always are, arguing that apologists don't usually understand the things they're even arguing, or they don't understand their own kind of epistemological foundations, which is often true. As a biblical scholar, I've talked a lot about the really terrible things apologetics does to the field of biblical studies, and it's so often based on modern understandings about the Bible, like the modern idea of inerrancy that they try to read back onto history and try to justify it as if it's some kind of intellectual position. And fundamentally, as I think about all this stuff, I had a conversation with a guy that's going to come out on the channel soon, and we were talking about things like religion and evolutionary biology and all sorts of interesting things, a really neat conversation. But we talked for a few minutes about apologetics, and as I came away, I've been doing some thinking about what apologetics actually does, and I want to throw this at you. I think that fundamentally, apologetics is a sort of pushback to modernity. It's an idea that, all truth is like worth arguing about, all truth is worth knowing like intellectually, worth making rational truth claims about. It's basically this kind of modernist idea that the way to get at truth is through this sort of intellectual, rigorous work of some sort. But the bigger underlying claim, I think the really meta claim, if you want to stop and see it, is that fundamentally, apologetics is based on a belief that the only function of religion is to be rational. That fundamentally, when you are exploring religion, when you are exploring a religious tradition, for example, your goal is to add up and look for the arguments for the most rational one, the one that makes the most sense, the one that has the best arguments, essentially. And that's the one you have to join. And that's the one that is true. And that's why when you see apologists talk about, biblical studies is one thing, but apologists spend a lot of time, for example, talking about morality, as if having some kind of metaphysical backing to morality, therefore makes it intrinsically true. So you see these types of arguments, and these are the types of things that apologists are doing. As they step into this discursive practice, they're fundamentally exercising in the idea that for a religion to be worth following, it needs to be rationally true. And that might even sound good. I think to somebody raised in Protestant Christianity, be like, yeah, I want my worldview to be true. I want my worldview to be internally coherent. Yeah, it sounds really good. The problem is, the big problem is that it asks something of religion that religion cannot do. Religion cannot just operate, and I'm including Christianity in this, and I'm including evangelical Christianity in this. This is important. Evangelical Christianity as a religion cannot just operate on the level of intellectual truth claims, because fundamentally religious knowledge exists in the realm of experience. It exists in the realm of the mystic. It exists in different realms. Even as a fundamentalist evangelical, I used to be one. We existed in different realms that aren't always intellectual, that aren't always rational. But what apologetics fundamentally tries to do is it fundamentally tries to actually strip belief. So even though we talk a lot about faith, it actually tries to strip faith away from the equation and make belief simply a matter of choosing the best arguments. And of course, above all else, that the most rational, intelligent thing you can ever do is to become a Christian. And usually if you listen to the apologists who I see, this means a Protestant evangelical Christian of some stripe. What does it actually do? when you look at religion in this way, as this type of intellectualizing approach to truth claims, you kind of have two responses. The first is where I kind of hang out now, I think, which is that most of the things that fit into the realm of religious experience, knowledge, are not just simply rationalist truth propositions, or you have the second approach. And this is what I think the apologist approach is. The apologist approach is fundamentally to twist the evidence and dumb it down so much that you pretend that you can just undertake this as a rationalist truth proposition, that you can just fight for this as some sort of pursuit of knowledge. And I think again and again, apologetics chooses the second. Because it's not just about making Christianity rational, it also destroys what makes Christianity the most valuable, or any religion for that matter. It destroys what makes religion fundamentally valuable. And religion and its value to human beings has always been in that it's anti-rational, that we look at the rational existence of a human life and the things that we believe we know to be true. And religion at its best always says maybe there's something more. Maybe this is infused with a meaning that we can't, touch, see, taste, or handle. Maybe there's life after death that appears to be the end of existence. That's fundamentally where religion lives. Religion at its best works when it's not just a rational explanation for things. Religion means maybe living with a mystery that you can't solve, or finding meaning that's beyond explanation, or practices that you do that don't just have instant ramifications in the real world, but that slowly form you over time. Or of course, above all, ideally, a community that you can belong to that will show you some kind of unconditional love, even when, in the Christian tradition, often we say we're not worth loving. And I find apologists often almost as a whole, maybe I'll go away and think about this and think about an exception, but intellectually, apologists are often very unimpressive. I find apologists often very disinterested in actually real historical questions, in developing competency. Apologists are interested in cosplaying intelligence. And I'll give you an example. Growing up, one of the smartest Christians that I had ever heard of was a guy named Ravi Zacharias. Now, we called him Dr. Ravi Zacharias, and this is important. He was a smart guy. Like, he wasn't an idiot. We would hear him talk. I would hear him do speeches. I loved listening to his lectures. I read his books. He was one of the earliest people to convince me that as a Christian, and I was an evangelical teenager, he convinced me that as a Christian, I could also have a rich life of the mind, and I could feel good knowing that my Christianity was not just something I believed blindly, but that I had an intelligent, rational faith that backed it up. And he always emphasized, and this is funny, Ravi Zacharias always called himself Dr. Ravi Zacharias. And he also often had, I remember reading his bios and stuff, and he would have Oxford and Cambridge in there often. And it only came out later that Ravi Zacharias never actually earned a PhD. Ravi Zacharias didn't really study at Cambridge. I think he did a visiting professor, or not professor, a visiting student kind of gig there. And he was a sort of professor at Oxford, but it was because evangelicals funded this chair for him to teach at Oxford. So he was an Oxford professor, not because he earned it, but because evangelicals bought him that position. And by the way, Oxford, this is a great way to ruin a great name of a university. I think Oxford has done this a little bit. Sidebar, lots of great scholars at Oxford, but when you lend your name out to people who are willing to pay for it, it can create problems. Now, Ravi had some credentials. He had a master's degree from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and he had honorary degrees given to him as he progressed in his career, but he never actually earned a doctorate. And in academic vocabulary, you're not supposed to say doctor unless you've actually earned one. I've actually earned one, so I actually can use the word Dr. Cornthwaite. Now, the thing about Ravi, as I reflect on this all these years later, is it's a perfect parable for the evangelical mind. It's a perfect parable for the role of Christian apologetics in faith, because fundamentally, it's mostly fake. It's mostly charades. The thing was never that Ravi wanted to be, an excellent scholar of something. He never wanted to get the credentials. He never went through it. I don't know much about his individual goals, but I didn't actually know any better, because the point was, as a young Christian kid, I was convinced by the charade. I was convinced by the fake titles that he hadn't earned. I was convinced by the associations with institutions that he had either purchased or vastly overstated. I saw him as the pinnacle of intellectualism. And he was actually living a lie, and in more ways than one, because he was also a serial abuser, but that is a different conversation for a different video. This pattern is actually everywhere if you stop to see it. I've engaged with an apologist in my comments, I won't say his name, but he often demands that his theories about the Bible be taken seriously. And the fact is, he has no training. He has never trained to be a Bible scholar. Once you see this pattern, it's everywhere. It lurks behind so much of Christian intellectualism, and in it specifically evangelical intellectualism, that it's this cosplay of intellect. You look at their institutions they set up, and it'll be called like the Reason Institute or the Wisdom or the Intelligence Dialogue or something like that, the Intelligence Forum. I'm just making these up, but you go Google intellectual organizations and see how many of them are called things like this. Evangelicals who work in these institutions and run them and are commissioned by them desperately want to prove that they are intelligent, that they are acting out and living this type of, can I say, reasonable faith. William Lane Craig, they want to prove that faith is rational, that faith is for intelligent people. On some level, you can make some intellectual arguments for faith, but most of apologetics that I see is barely even doing this. Most of apologetics is actually just performing. It's a performance, I think, for believers more so than for unbelievers. Maybe it convinces some people, but there's very little interest in actually becoming great scholars. There's very little interest in actually mastering sources because these people know what they believe before they even start studying. And I promise you, I'll issue this challenge. Go look at any popular apologist in the world right now that people know and talk about. I'm not going to single anybody out, but go actually do a deep dive on what their credentials actually are. And you will find almost universally, probably not universally, but almost universally, they often overstate their credentials. They often overstate their expertise. They're often talking about things with a sense of authority that they're not actually experts in. And they are playing this game of pandering to people while pretending that they are doing deep, rigorous intellectual work. And it's not, it's theater. I was reflecting on this because I was thinking about my own relationship to education and to learning. And I remember how confusing it was as a smart kid, because growing up, I actually did believe the charade. Like, I watched people like Ravi and I thought, yeah, the point is actually to become smart. The point is to study hard. The point is to ask hard questions. And when I went and did that in my own studies and I got the degrees, frankly, more education than Ravi ever had, I got this kind of education. I think it was confusing for me to get to the end of that and to find that I didn't have faith communities left to speak to, that I had actually become, to an extent, overeducated, and that the education had problematized my faith. I think I've often thought that if I just try to be really honest and genuine about why my convictions have led me away, for example, from fundamentalist evangelicalism, that people would get it, but they don't really get it. And what happens often is people are angry or they're scoffing. This is a very common reaction I find when people are like, oh, you think you're so smart, like that kind of like scoffing, mocking kind of tone. And I think one of the ironies as I reflect on this is I can actually flip around like what the intellectual cosplay, what the charades is actually doing to ordinary people. Because people kind of do accept this apologist logic that the goal of faith is basically to have the best arguments or to be the most rational. And then I think people flip that around and they actually believe that because they have faith, they are the most rational. I think a lot of people in my comments seem to think that they have the intellectual upper hand by virtue of belonging to the faith tradition. So it's a weird, like, another twist on this, that a lot of people, I think, the apologetics world serves to convince people that the things they believe are really rational, serves to convince people that they have the intellectual high ground. And even though they're not necessarily, really educated in these topics themselves, they become convinced that anybody who challenges their beliefs is actually being irrational. When people question the things that are irrational, because an apologist told me that this is like a rational outworking of my belief, then that person becomes irrational. Because if you believe something so confidently, because apologists have convinced you it's rational, then the only way that anybody could disbelieve it is because they're being irrational. People like me sort of violate the norms of evangelical discourse. If a rational pursuit of truth leads you elsewhere outside of our biblical inerrancy or whatever your specific Christian foundations are. If the rational pursuit of truth leads you outside of that, it wasn't a rational pursuit of truth, because this is the truth all along. So it's still like you still have the presuppositions, but it actually warps the rules of rationalism. And I think this is the tell. I think the people who are following these apologists have this tell. I think apologists themselves have the tell. And the thing is, it's never about truth. It's a religion. It's about loyalty. It's about fidelity. It's about performing. It's about showing that you're in the right club. It's about showing that you believe the right things. It's about dogmatism. So even while apologists and some of these people try to pretend that they've actually sort of won the intellectual game, what they're actually doing, I think, is exercising a lot of the worst characteristics of a very toxic religious system, because it's actually not about the intellect. You're performing intellect to justify the fact that you can be tribalistic, or that you can, support your in-group at all costs, or that you don't want to listen to people who think differently than you, or whatever. This is fundamentally the religious instinct at the root of this. So you've come full circle, and you've convinced people now that the whole point of religion is to find the best arguments, or to find the best, the best truth propositions, or the most rational way to look at the world. But then you perform it, and then you pretend to be rational because your ideas aren't all that rational sometimes, and you have a group of people who are just as dogmatic as ever. And this is kind of the circle I see with apologetics. I see it fundamentally doesn't really seem to do all that much. It doesn't seem to make people more thoughtful from what I've experienced. I love to be proven wrong on this. I'm hoping there are a ton of thoughtful Christians, thoughtful evangelicals. I just haven't met them. It more just seems to fall into this camp of dogmatism, tribalism, pretending to be intelligent, performing, cosplaying intellect, but actually not taking anything very seriously. Cosplaying intelligence, but not actually being intelligent. And here's the rub. Here's the thing for somebody like me who does choose to belong in a religious tradition, is that when I'm in the Christian tradition, because I'm still a Christian, my faith is not based in rationalism. My faith is not based in the best arguments. Faith is actually not rational, like it can't be. I mean, we could have an important talk about what faith is in antiquity, which I do think it is something a lot different than what we think about it today. But most of us have a relationship to religion that cannot simply be explained in rational terms. Religion has mystery baked into it. It has transcendence baked into it. It should have a lot of living with uncertainty. Religion, honestly, it should have a lot of uncertainty baked into it. If you want your religion to have certainty, you are living with a childish religion. Like, religion needs to have uncertainty. Religion needs to have meaning beyond rationalism, beyond explanation, beyond things that we can just explain with human language. The famous verse is, "Eye has not seen, nor has ear heard, nor has entered into the heart of a human the things that God has prepared for those who love him." Like, even in the tradition, you have this idea that there's a mystery that can't fully be expressed by ourselves and our intellect. And we need to preserve that. And to close, I think it's ironic that I wasn't a very good student when I was an evangelical, because I knew the answers. I was just looking for rubber stamps for everything I already believed. But now that I'm on the other side of that type of evangelical fundamentalist place that I once lived in, it's amazing to me that the world is endlessly interesting. I have so many questions. I have so many questions about the tradition, and I can just look at them all with, interest and curiosity. And so many of the apologists I encounter have such a sad lack of curiosity. They just don't care. They're not curious. They're just interested in finding the right checkboxes. They're finding the right proof points that they can use to back up their pre-existing modern conclusions. It's sad. And the thing that I find about throwing off those intellectual shackles and stop worrying about pretending that you're smart. Stop trying to convince people that you have the most rational, reasonable faith. Why not just go live the tradition and explore it and ask hard questions and not always need the answers? To me, that's a much more satisfying way to live. And frankly, that's why I think apologetics is pathetic. I think it's just honestly really sad. And I think that life more abundantly lives somewhere beyond that pathetic little need to know and need to be rational, and an ability to engage with religion with a recognition that it's not just valuable because it's the best explanation or because it's the most rational, but maybe there's deeper truth claims at play here. Religion for Humans has offered us a way to say, I don't know, but I'm going to live as if this were true, or I'm going to hope that there's a mystery of transcendence beyond all this. The mystery is very much the point. The fact that there could be something that transcends the intellect or transcends the rational is exactly very much the point. But apologetics doesn't give us that. Instead, what apologetics seems to do most frequently is trade all of the things that are the most beautiful about my tradition, about the Christian tradition, trade that for cheap debate tactics and fake credentials that they try to use to impress people in order to get them to either stay or maybe to convert. So here's one more thing that I think we need to hear. If apologetics convinced you that Christianity was rational and then failed you in arguing that or failed you in proving that, don't let that be the only Christianity that you know. Don't let the only experience of Christianity be trying to fight over truth propositions with our intellects. There's an entire Christian tradition that values mystery over certainty, that values questions over answers, that values practices over the propositions, and that is willing to live in a state of not always knowing all the answers. That's a Christianity that I think is worth belonging to, not the fake credentials or fake intellectualism. Religion at its best isn't about trying to win arguments. It's not about trying to prove that we're the most rational. It's about recognizing that there could be things that are not strictly touched by the rational mind or the rational existence, and being willing to live in that mystery or that uncertainty. And that's a place that I would much rather hang out. So just a couple more reflections on apologetics, why I think they're so empty, and why I have such a huge problem with them ongoing. And I think I always will. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Love to hear from you. As always, I'll see you next time.